I think her subtle comments about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan representing a threat to Japan's survival, implying, of course, that Japan might have to join the fight if China invaded Taiwan, was a very smart thing to do. It is essential that both Japan and the United States make it clear to China that Japan and the United States will come to the aid of Taiwan, because that is the best way to avoid a war over Taiwan. But Europe was the most dangerous place on the planet during the Cold War. Today, East Asia is the most dangerous place on the planet. My bottom line is that if the Chinese cannot win a quick and decisive victory in their pursuit of conquering Taiwan, they will not attack. If the Chinese think that they may not even be able to conquer Taiwan, they will not attack, and we will not have a war. But, as I emphasized before, it is essential that both Japan and the United States make it clear to China that Japan and the United States will come to the aid of Taiwan, because that is the best way to avoid a war over Taiwan. You all remember, I'm sure, that President Biden said on 4 separate occasions that the United States would defend Taiwan if it was attacked. That was not accidental. We all know that President Biden doesn't have the best memory and sometimes spoke in rather opaque ways. But I think when a president of the United States says 4 times that the United States will defend Taiwan, he is sending a clear signal to China. Turning to Prime Minister Takaichi, I think her subtle comments about a Chinese invasion of Taiwan representing a threat to Japan's survival, implying, of course, that Japan might have to join the fight if China invaded Taiwan, was a very smart thing to do. Some might say that her comments, much like President Biden's comments, made war more likely, and therefore they were dangerous comments. I disagree. I think President Biden's comments and the Prime Minister's comments were smart comments, and they make war less likely because they make it clear to Japan that if it starts a war, it will be a certain defeat, or maybe I should say an almost certain defeat. Well, I think there's no question that what the Prime Minister said greatly angered the Chinese, and that has some negative consequences. But you have to weigh the negative consequences against the positive consequences. And my argument was that on balance, what she said made good sense because it makes a war less likely. So the question is, what is China trying to do today in East Asia? And the answer is very simple. China is interested in being a regional hegemon. And that makes perfect sense. If I were the national security advisor in Beijing, I would tell Xi Jinping, we want to dominate East Asia the way the Americans dominate the Western Hemisphere. There is a powerful tendency in countries like Japan and countries like the United States to describe the Chinese as the bad guys and to view Japan and the United States as the good guys. but this is a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about international politics. China is merely interested in maximizing its prospects for survival, the same way that Japan was interested in maximizing its prospects for survival between 1868 and 1945. To make my point clear, if Japan today was really powerful compared to China and all the other countries in East Asia, you would try to become a regional hegemon in East Asia. You would try to dominate East Asia because that is the best way to survive in international politics. This brings us to the question of American policy. What is the United States going to do? As I told you before, the United States does not tolerate peer regional hegemons. We have a rich history of preventing other countries from becoming regional hegemons. Of course, what this means is that the United States is going to go to great lengths to contain China. It is not going to allow China, if it can, to dominate East Asia. Nor is Japan going to allow China to dominate East Asia if it can prevent that. So you see that what I'm saying is that strategic logic says that, number one, China should try to dominate Asia because that's the best way to survive, and two, the United States and Japan should go to enormous lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. So the end result is that you're going to have an intense security competition centered on East Asia between the United States and its allies on one side and China and its allies on the other side. Anyway, I'm going to conclude at this point and just say that I think it's imperative that you understand that you live in the most dangerous area of the world. East Asia is a very dangerous region, in large part because the U.S.-China competition is centered in East Asia. During the Cold War, the conflict between the superpowers was centered in Europe. This is not to say there was zero danger in East Asia of a conflict between the superpowers. There was always that potential. But Europe was the most dangerous place on the planet during the Cold War. Today, East Asia is the most dangerous place on the planet. And the competition between the United States and China, which will of course involve Japan on the side of the United States, is going to be intense. And the potential for war is going to be there. And it's going to take smart policy on the part of Japanese policymakers and American policymakers and Chinese policymakers, plus a lot of luck to avoid a crisis down the road turning into a shooting war. Thank you. Yes, I think that's correct. President Biden started the war, in my opinion. The war started on February 24th, 2022. It's quite remarkable, but before the war started, the Russians went to great lengths to prevent a war. The Russians wanted a diplomatic solution, and the United States had no interest in a diplomatic solution. Right after the war started, shortly after the war started, Putin reached out to Ukraine and said, let's negotiate a settlement to the war that results in you, Ukraine, not joining NATO.
はい。
So the famous Istanbul negotiations then took place in March and early April of 2022. Remember, the war starts on February 24th. Almost immediately after the war starts, negotiations to settle the war take place in Istanbul. That's March and early April 2022. Excuse me. The Russians and the Ukrainians are making excellent progress towards reaching an agreement. And the Americans and the British come in and tell Zelensky and the Ukrainians to walk away from the negotiations. This is remarkable because, as you were saying, the war has been going on for 3 years now. And here, shortly after the war started, we had an opportunity to end it. And who put an end to those negotiations? The United States and the British. For the rest of his term in office, Joe Biden never showed any interest in a diplomatic solution to the war. Zero. Trump, to his credit, was interested from the beginning in settling the war. He has been unable to do that for a variety of reasons, but at least you have to give Trump credit for trying to end the war, whereas Biden made zero attempts to end the war. I think that the fundamental difference is that we played hardball. We were tough with the Russians because we thought they were weak. When we told Zelensky to walk away from the negotiations, again, this is in March, April 2022, shortly after the war started, we told Zelensky to walk away. The question is why? We told Zelensky to walk away because we thought that the Ukrainians, working with NATO, could defeat the Russians. We thought we could beat them on the battlefield, and we thought that economic sanctions would strangle the Russian economy and bring the Russians to their knees. You want to remember that the Ukrainians won 2 major victories against the Russians in 2022. By the end of 2022, the Ukrainians held the upper hand on the battlefield. So the reason that the Hawks won on Ukraine was because they thought they could win a quick and easy victory. Taiwan is a completely different situation. There's going to be no easy victory for anyone in Taiwan. In fact, a war over Taiwan would be a catastrophe. One of the great paradoxes of military strategy is that the more horrible a war is likely to be, the less likely it is that that war will happen. And I hope you all understand that's the logic that underpins nuclear deterrence. Nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. They're absolutely horrendous. I don't have to tell a Japanese audience this. But the fact that they are so horrendous is what produces so much deterrence. It's what makes war unlikely. So you want to remember that if you have a war over Taiwan with just conventional forces, non-nuclear forces, just conventional forces, it would be a catastrophic war. It would be extremely bloody, protracted. Nevertheless, you would have two countries deeply involved that had nuclear weapons, the United States and China. And you could never be sure that nuclear escalation wouldn't take place. And it's that threat that produces so much deterrence.